All right, so I wanted to welcome everyone to our first town hall. We are part of the student council, specifically the school board liaisons, and we've been working with the school board to create a stream of communications with the community. So we just wanted to begin this meeting by having an introduction, having the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Charles Burdell Williams.
Yeah, there are great advantages to having your last name start with B. That's awesome. I like that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Burdell Williams. I'm getting close to finishing my first official year on the school board. I've lived in Cheltenham for the last 8 years with my wife and 2 children. I moved to Cheltenham. I made the choice to choose Cheltenham because of the diversity, because of the nearness to the city, and just the pure beauty of the community. Just personally, I work for Merck professionally in pharmaceutical manufacturing operations. The core reason why I'm here, because it may not align with what my career experience is that what you may not know about me, and you may not know about a lot of other people, is that I'm a student that truly benefited from having access, opportunity, and experience growing up in Detroit. I had a mom who was very serious about my education because she understood as a social worker the importance of access and opportunity and experience. And so the main reason why I'm on the school board is to be able to provide those things for all of the students in the district to my best ability and to hold us accountable for getting there. And I appreciate you guys for putting forth the effort to create these town halls and for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Next, we're going to do David Cohen.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for hosting the event and inviting us. I'm glad to be here today. A little bit of background. I grew up in Cheltenham Township and I moved back here about 22 years ago. I have 3 daughters, 2 of whom went to school district for K through 12 and graduated. And my youngest daughter is a student at the high school. Professionally, I'm an urban planner. I work in economic development on a lot of policy issues and grant opportunities and working with communities around parts of the country. On school board, I try to work on planning and on trying to make sure that we address both immediate needs and long-term needs. And I work a lot, both professionally and also personally. I believe a lot in equity and about the common good, and trying to make sure as a planner, a way of background, that I look at things that benefit all of society in different ways. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, next we want to welcome Bill England.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for hosting this and providing the opportunity to be here today and to try to answer some questions and talk a little bit about the community from the perspective of the board and for us to listen. My family and I came to Cheltenham. Like Mr. Burdell Williams, we chose Cheltenham. We came here for all the reasons that you see on the bumper sticker that's on some cars. We came here for the diversity and the history and the green. Cheltenham is a wonderful community to live in. Not perfect, no communities are, but we have a lot of good things going for us in Cheltenham. My only daughter, Sarah, graduated last June from Cheltenham and has moved on to her collegiate career. Prior to joining the board, I have always tried to be involved in the community, and I was on the Human Relations Committee here in Cheltenham, the first committee that was put forth to try to address equality and equity in Cheltenham. I have enjoyed in the past coaching soccer and being involved in sports, and am on the school board because I believe in public education. I believe that there is a need for us to provide access to the best of what we can. And my belief and hope is that we're constantly working to improve what we're offering to our students and to our community. The school districts are the core of a community, and education is fundamental and critical in a democracy. But today, it's just wonderful to be engaged by the student body and have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about things. So I'll stop there. I just want to thank you for the invitation today and look forward to this program.
Thank you, Mr. England. Next, we'll do Joel Fishbein.
Thank you. It always takes me a second to find the mute button with my mouse. My name's Joel Fishbein. I'm finishing my 5th year on the board. I've been elected twice to serve the community. I'm a lawyer by training, so I bring a lot of the analytical skills that I've developed as a lawyer to my work on the board. I have 3 children. The oldest graduated from Cheltenham in 2014 and went on to Syracuse. My middle son has special needs, and I'll get back to that. My daughter graduated this past June from Cheltenham High School. And one of the things that motivated me to get onto the school board and in my work on the school board is my child with special needs showed me a window into the district that is different than many people experience, and it gave me the motivation to work to make sure that children who have special needs in their families have their interests advocated for. Since I've been on the board, and it's been a passion of mine to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's our most important work, and it is something that motivates this board in ways that it's hard for us to express. And I hope today will give us an opportunity to give you a window into the things that we think and the things that we've done on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to thank Noah and Lisa for putting this all together and giving us the platform to do that.
Thank you. Next, we want to welcome Ms. Haywood.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I guess maybe it's afternoon at this point, but I wanted to also thank Noah and Lisa for organizing these town halls. It's a really great opportunity for us to hear from students and also, as importantly, to listen to students. And I've been on the board, this is my 2nd term, actually going to my 3rd term. So it's my 9th year on the board, finishing up my 9th year. Currently this year, I'm president of the board. And I think like so many on the board, our family also chose Cheltenham. In fact, we chose Cheltenham before we even looked for houses. We actually went around to all the elementary schools at the time my children were elementary school aged, and really went to all the elementary schools, settled in Wyncote, and always have been very involved with the community, starting with the Wyncote PTO. I was one of the steering committee members of the Cheltenham African American Alliance when it first started, part of the UPG, as well as co-president of the high school PTO before actually joining the board. Professionally, I'm an attorney, a healthcare attorney. I work in-house for a large insurance company. And really, I think the transition to the board was kind of interesting, because I think you go from a real advocacy role to a larger, bigger, more important role. And you still are advocating, but it really, from my lens, has always been from a lens of access, equity, and opportunity, really for all students. And realizing that your role and the importance of public education is to make sure that those opportunities are available to every student who walks through our doors. I'm also a parent of 3 adult children, all of whom graduated from Cheltenham. They're adults now, 30s and late 20s, and they really had a good foundation in Cheltenham and want that kind of experience for every student who, and even more for every student who walks through our doors. I'm married to Art Haywood, who many of you probably know, who is now Senator Art Haywood. but I'm really pleased to be here today. So I wanted to thank you very much for the invitation and really to listen and share. So thank you.
Perfect. And so now we will start taking questions. So if you have any questions, please just place them in the Q&A section. And then next we'll hear from Jennifer Lehman.
Is Jenny muted for others, or is it just me?
Here, try and talk. All right, we'll get that resolved in a minute. Well, then let's move on to Daniel Schultz, and then we'll come back.
Sure. Yeah, hi, my name's Dan Schultz. I am on I guess this is my third year on the board. So I'm in my first term. I grew up in Cheltenham. I graduated in 2005. So I went through Wyncote all the way through Cheltenham High School, and my wife and I actually both did that, and we moved back and have two kids, one who just started kindergarten, so she doesn't quite know the difference between in-person and virtual education, but she's looking forward to it all. I got on the board. I had my background and just being a part of a community. I started getting involved once we moved back, and that was probably around 4.5 or 5 years ago now. Started getting involved and paying attention to the district. We knew Cheltenham was a great school district, but we as kids didn't, we had the lenses of kids, and so knowing about what goes into running a school system, what goes into changing the public school system to actually address some of the problems that I think we're probably going to be talking about on this call, we were frankly naive to it. And so I will say that my eyes have been wildly opened in the past 3 years, just getting a chance to really understand the way that Cheltenham School District has been a bit of a tale of two schools, and that's not uncommon for public school systems in general. And I think really from, I'll say day 2, because day 1 was spent learning about it, but day 2 on the board, the issue of racial achievement opportunity gaps has been sort of the #1 challenge, and how do we make sure that we, within the constraints of the community's resources, address these needs. I serve as a co-chair of the finance committee, so a lot of my time, all the board members serve on the different committees, educational affairs and etc. But being a chair just means you're kind of helping run those specific meetings. So I serve with Joel, and I'm also on the co-chair of the policy committee, and the board will set policies, which is, I think, probably going to be a running theme of this conversation, because policy is where we as a board can have the biggest impact on equity. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So Ms. Lehman, does your microphone work now?
Still no. Can you
Okay.
call in?
Yeah, maybe that'll work. But for now, we actually do have a question regarding the strategic plan. So Ms. Haywood, would you like to maybe talk about the strategic plan and possibly finishing it, or even what it is?
Yes, so the strategic plan is really a living, working document that we had collectively, really as a community, worked on 5 years ago, actually. We're going into our 5th year in 2021. And the strategic plan really provides more of a roadmap in terms of 5 different strands. And those are student achievement, health and wellness. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the other strands at this point. Communication, I know professional development, and there's probably one more that I'm forgetting about at this point. But those strands really try to, and curriculum instruction. So those strands really try to guide the school district in those different areas to basically say, what goals do we have for each year in those different strands, and how are we going to reach those goals? And that document, and I say it's a living, breathing document because it is a template document in terms of a roadmap, but it doesn't change the day-to-day operations of the school district as we try to meet those goals. There's so much more that goes on behind the scenes other than what's in our strategic plan, and that is posted on our website. That plan was put together by over 100 community members, including as well administration, teachers, students, board members, and other parents and family and community groups. And it was important to really get all of those perspectives when we developed the strategic plan, because again, it provided more of a roadmap of where we were going and where we wanted to get to from 5 years ago until where we want to be in 2021. We will be looking at that strategic plan and determining how we're going to assemble a group to also evaluate what we achieved, what were challenges we still have left open in terms of tasks as we build that plan going forward. Each year, we do have an evaluation of the strategic plan goals and objectives and kind of where we landed at the end of each year. As you can imagine, a little more difficult to do that when we were virtual at the end of the school year this past year, because there was just, a big interruption in how we were delivering even instruction at that point. Does that answer your question?
Yes, exactly. We appreciate it very much. And then just a follow up to Mr. Schultz, specifically, can you speak about the steps being taken to close the achievement gap since the adoption of the strategic plan, and progress made or not, for that matter, pre-pandemic, and what steps taken to address in light of the pandemic?
That's a big one. I will also.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Julie,
Dan, if you wanted to.
Okay, sure. I will also
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, I want to invite fellow board members to jump in, because that is a very big question, because there's a lot of things. I will try to. If I were to try to list all of them alone, I would be talking as much as I usually talk, and I'm trying not to do that. So
we'll have Dan, other board members also jump in, and I'd also offer, if Dr. Marseille is listening in, if there's anything that we have forgotten to mention, please feel free to offer that as well.
Yeah. So one thing I'll just say is we use the term achievement gap as this kind of it's a gigantic concept, and there's a lot more to it than just raw test scores. It's everything from who's identified in the gifted program, who's identified as needing IEPs, who's suspended, who is called out for an action that somebody else might not be called out for. I mean, I'm describing things that I think a lot of people, a lot of students in particular, probably understand to some extent, because they're witnessing inequalities and inequities. But those things translate to a lot of data-driven things. You can look at data and say, this isn't right. And there's a question coming up around the equity policy, and I think the equity policy is a fair, there's an equity statement and an equity policy, and what that's trying to do is just codify, this is what we're seeing. We are seeing outcomes that can be predicted based on a student's identity, and that isn't acceptable. So things that have been taken, I'll pick one. For example, the identification of students in the gifted program. The district, I believe it was 2 years ago, switched the mechanism used, the test that is used, as a screener for who would be identified as gifted, away from one that really is around, do you know what a set of skis is, and would you use that in the winter, where somebody who just moved to Cheltenham from a warm climate, who's 8 years old and maybe actually has never seen a pair of skis, that doesn't mean they're not gifted. So shifting away from sort of language and cultural based test questions over to pattern recognition, which is a more universal thing. So that's just one very small example of the kind of incremental step, and I'm sure other board members will talk about a lot of other ones. Those kinds of steps are what needs to happen on a system level. And if nobody jumps in, I will list more. So that's my threat.
No. So I think Charles wanted to add something as well as
Yes,
David Cohen.
I would, thank you.
If that's okay, Noah.
Yeah, if that's all right, Noah. Yes, so yes, to add on to what both Dan and Julie have already shared. Yes, we spent an entire educational affairs meeting each year covering the progress in each of the 5 years of the strategic plan. So I think that information is available. The presentation is available on the district's website that summarizes all of the actions that have been taken in the five pathways. Again, we do that on an annual basis. With this being year 4, one of the things that stood out to me from a pre-pandemic progress standpoint is the implementation of curriculum at a few levels in the district. So very important was having a curriculum across the district that was common across the K to 8 grades, given that specifically for our K to 4 students, they are in 4 different buildings that are distinct. They're all in Cheltenham, but they all have their own small nuances. And what we wanted is a curriculum that encompassed those nuances and was also designed to promote student learning from a very equitable standpoint, so that one teacher would not be necessarily presenting information at a greater rate or with more depth or breadth than another teacher. That what we have is a curriculum that drives that breadth and depth of instruction. And so this year, again, one of the items that really stood out to me was the work that has been done from the administration, from our teachers and teacher leaders on developing curriculum. It is a very hard and arduous journey, but the fact that we have a developed K through 8 writing curriculum and a 7 and 8 English and language arts curriculum, I think those are very great places for us to start. I know the district is still continuing their work on developing curriculum in other areas, so that when we have our review next year, which will be the wrap up, this is year 5 of the strategic plan, that we will have even more curriculum and more what I'll call equitable implementation of educational experiences across the district. Again, I think it's maybe difficult to see why we would need a balanced curriculum for everyone to be able to experience. But I think if we just break it down by understanding and recognizing that we want all of our students, once they reach grade 5 and are in school together at Elkins Park, that everyone is bringing a very similar, identical, if we can, to our best ability toolbox to the table, from their lived experiences, from just being in the school environment, but specifically from what is being taught from a curriculum standpoint. So again, I could, we could spend an entire meeting, which we do every year, discussing the successes. But I did want to just share one moment about what I thought was one of the most important aspects of our growth in completing year 4 of the strategic plan. Thank you.
And then David Cohen.
Thank you. I just want to address a few points. Several years ago, the school district, on a voluntary basis, had an educational audit done, and the audit really pointed out a lot of issues and, frankly, deficiencies in a wide range of areas, including equity. And that led to us recognizing the magnitude and extent of needing to develop curriculum that Mr. Burdell Williams spoke about. So that was an outgrowth of that as well. And again, that audit was very extensive, and it was gone over by the board and the administration. And that's being used effectively in alignment with the strategic plan as somewhat of a guidebook, so to speak, to help address a range of educational issues that need to be addressed systematically, including a series of ones with equity. Addressing a second point briefly, following up on the comments about gifted students, we also, besides going to a test that gets away from cultural and other types of biases that were inherent in the test, we also identified ways to have students be identified for potentially being gifted and taking the exam, that tried to also identify and move away from some inherent biases as well, that before were overweighting the number of white students proportionally versus minority students that were disproportionately not taking the test. So we addressed that aspect as well in terms of the gifted program. And finally, as also was mentioned, every year back when pre-pandemic, when there were standardized tests, we look at the scores and try to identify, big focus is looking at different cohorts, including minority students, and trying to identify the achievement gap, the magnitude, where we're doing better, where we're doing worse in some cases, and what are some patterns and opportunities and ways to try to address the issue. So those are just three aspects I wanted to address as well. Thank you.
Next can be Bill England.
Yes, thank you. I'll try not to repeat things that everybody else has said, but these two items that we're talking about here, the strategic plan and the achievement gap, are critical, obviously, here in Cheltenham. I want to say that we had somewhat of an awakening following the arrival of Dr. Marseille. Now, I'll say it was actually starting before he got here, in terms of who we are as a district, who we are as a community. And this was a very positive thing. All things change in life, and things had been changing here in Cheltenham. We had not had a strategic plan for a while. The achievement gap was something that we did review one night a year on an educational affairs meeting. And it was those are very intense meetings, evenings, when we're looking at the primary thing that we look at are test scores. And that's a concern I have for starters, our standardized test scores. I think that you as students need to be looked at as more than standardized tests. And we look for different instruments for how can we gauge who you are and what you're doing, and measure the individual student against yourself in making progress, and not simply against a field that is largely skewed away from a Cheltenham. With the achievement gap, we have a lot of things not working in our favor, starting with curriculum and educational materials. These are not put together from historically have not been put together with a cultural eye to them. They are put together from a majority, with a very white approach. A small fact that's very important is that the state of Texas is the largest purchaser of educational books, of textbooks. And for that reason, a lot of what goes into textbooks comes out of what they're doing in Texas. So that's just something to ponder. These are the kinds of things that we are aware of, that we're working to try to alleviate. The achievement gap, beyond the materials and the outside influences, what we're trying to do internally is we have, as has been said, we have been looking at what are our tests to identify gifted and to identify students who need additional challenge. We have been looking at curriculum, or the need to update the curriculum. We did have an issue with curriculums that had not been put together K to 12 or updated for years. So those are a couple important things that are kind of behind the scenes, but we have a long way to go in closing the achievement gap. We need to continue to look at what are our Cheltenham students doing? What is their experience? What more can we expose our students to in terms of the world around us and in being prepared for life. We're also changing our curriculum and over time the materials and the readings to be reflective of a culturally diverse community. So I don't know if I'm answering the questions, but these are very important to me. When we do go to write another strategic plan, I would encourage everybody who's listening here to think about becoming involved in some way, whether it's joining a committee or attending a meeting and voicing your opinions or concerns. These things all make it into the strategic plan. Thanks.
Okay, so we wanted to give the second part of that question. Are there tangible action steps attached to it? And if so, what are they? To Joel Fishbein.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hard to say that many of our tangible action steps are specifically and solely directed to the achievement gap, because so much of what has been done in the last 5 years is on positive behavior, instructional support kinds of things, and the way we discipline, the way we react to negative events. I don't have to tell anyone on this call, falls more heavily on Black boys. So when we talk about discipline and we talk about behavioral supports and we talk about, we've implemented youth court, we've done a lot of things that if we do them well and with fidelity from kindergarten through 12th grade, then we will see different outcomes, because we will not have the same kind of disproportionate taking out of the classroom of our Black students. To me, that is not something that anyone would frame in achievement gap terms, but if we do it well and right, that will have an impact on the achievement gap. We did that partly because we saw that equity, that from an equity lens, discipline from an equity lens, before that became a national conversation, frankly. And a little bit of history for people who are newer to the district, and Ms. Haywood and Mr. Cohen and I are probably the only ones on this call who remember it, but when Chris McGinley was superintendent 15, 20 years ago, his focus was closing the achievement gap. This is not a new conversation here. We very much regret that we haven't made the kind of progress we would like to see, but it has not been for lack of effort, and that's for sure. But I do think that the things that we're talking about now, the changes in curriculum, the changes in identifying gifted students, the changes in discipline, and the hyper focus on the inequities in the system, the implicit biases that cause students to feel like they're not in the system that's made for them. The changing of those things, which we are absolutely committed to do, and part of that's professional development, part of that is just becoming more aware as people, as human beings, about what is going on in this country and what needs to be fixed in our little corner of it. So the idea, and Mr. Schultz alluded to this, the idea that we could make a laundry list of things that came out of the strategic plan that we did to close the achievement gap is sort of, I think, the wrong question. The way that we are operating this district should holistically impact the achievement gap. I don't know whether that is responsive in a way that people would like to have their questions responded to, but I think it certainly is broader than the question. So I think that answer is important to understand. And I think at some point today, and it doesn't have to be me, the people on this call should understand the division of roles between the board, the administration, and building leadership, and how each of those elements of the district have impact the students' experiences. If I don't want to take too much time, but I think that's an important subject so that people who aren't familiar with those things can gain an understanding of how those responsibilities are divided among the different leadership elements of the district.
Thank you. And Ms. Haywood, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Joel, as well. I think it is a very complex, complicated question and response, but I wanted to be a little more concrete in terms of, we looked at, this is really a very data-driven process. So it wasn't just saying to, or the administration basically saying, we know that we have an achievement or opportunity gap, and what are we going to do about it? It was really disaggregating the data, which we've been doing for several years, and basically looking at achievement, both academic achievement, looking at discipline referrals, looking at, the number of students who are getting Ds during their first marking period. We were looking at the number of students who were in gifted programs and honors programs and had those opportunities. We were looking at those students who had been identified as needing special needs, and other data points. And so that was the beginning point to say, what are we seeing, and what are we seeing from a equity, achievement, and opportunity lens? And then how are we going to address those issues going forward? And then what have we seen as a result of addressing those issues? And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One that Mr. Fishbein did talk about were the number of discipline referrals that disproportionately affected African-American boys. And we said, can we kind of revisit, Dr. Mercedes said, can we revisit our discipline policy in and of itself to basically say, should we be looking at a discipline policy that was more appropriate in terms of consequences for elementary, middle school, and high school students? And should we be adding in much more of an emphasis on restorative practices? And so as a result, we did modify significantly. Administration came back with significant changes and recommendations to the policy committee and ultimately to the board, which adopted a more even-handed, practical approach to discipline, which also resulted in the number of discipline referrals declining. And that was then evaluated at the end of the year so we could see where we started and where we ended. Another example is also looking at the number of students who are recommended for honors and AP classes, and looking at that based on disaggregated data. And then at the end of the year, asking the question, how many more students of color were recommended and how successful were they in those classes? So those are just, and just one other example was from a curricular perspective, I'm asking ourselves, is our curriculum culturally relevant? Does it really reflect the diversity of our student population, quite frankly, the world? And how are we going to make it more culturally relevant and actually just fuller curriculum? And as Mr. Cohen alluded to, we did a curriculum audit, which showed that we had significant curricular gaps, which we had been filling over the last couple of years. But in doing that, we also looked at the content and the materials that we were purchasing of curriculum to make sure that they really, did reflect the diversity of our student body. The piece of that Dr. Marseille is also putting in, believe this year, is doing some piloting, for example, of some some components for social studies curriculum that are not necessarily have been part of our curriculum to date. And those pilots of those programs will allow us to get more information about the Haitian Revolution, for example, the Civil War and African American history, not just from an enslavement perspective, but from a perspective of honoring the accomplishments and achievements. So I think those are just some of the examples, along with cultural proficiency training, which has been ongoing for several years in our school district among staff, among administrators, and actually even starting with the board as well. And so those are just some more concrete examples of how the changes that have been made, within the school system to really address equity, opportunity, and access, and to, address the achievement gap overall.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We appreciate that very much. Now, the next question will be going to Charles Burdell Williams, and it is a comment by Elisa Davidson that basically says, Dr. Bernadette T. Love, professor of education at the University of Georgia, states that deficit language that frames Black and Brown children's educational experience is rooted and guided by whiteness. This deficit language includes gaps, achievement, opportunity, and language, as well as stating that minority is deficit language as well.
Yes, thank you. I want to just share with Ms. Elisa Davidson that I'm grateful for that comment. And as Ms. Haywood just alluded to, the board beginning this year engaged in some cultural proficiency training and workshops with Dr. Barbara Moore Williams regarding our ability to become more culturally proficient. Dr. Marseille has invested a significant amount of time with his administration in developing professional learning that will help staff and administrators and teachers become more culturally proficient, build a more culturally proficient curriculum, and also from an equity lens, build that a more culturally proficient school district from the student's perspective as well. Because once the teachers and administrators can effectively speak from a lens of cultural proficiency and equity, they begin to introduce learned behaviors to their students that will perpetuate over time. And that is where you build a new culture within our school buildings and within our students. So I wanted to first, I didn't get to the appreciation, but I greatly appreciate that comment, because I believe that one of the learnings for us, even as a school board, are things like deficit language and understanding how to appropriately describe and frame what it is we are, discussing at a moment in time. I know that I believe it is Gloria Latson Billings who has done some work and written done some professional work on deficit language, written some essays, done some research, and I know that that is a topic that we have touched, but I think it's extremely important to know that we are focusing on becoming more culturally proficient as a board. From our own perspective, again, if we are to implement policy and help support the superintendent as he drives to make recommendations about how to improve the cultural proficiency of our teacher leaders and teachers in general, I think it's important that we have a more clear understanding as well. And I know that personally, many of the board members are down the path of exercising their learning opportunities, becoming culturally proficient on their own. But it's really important to note that we as a board are also moving in that direction as well. And it's been a breath of fresh air. I can't wait for us to be able to establish how we'll be able to do that via Zoom. So hopefully we can get back going with Dr. Barbara Moore Williams sooner than later, now that some of our really challenging decisions are behind us. Well, we've made some challenging decisions, and I think we have a good period where we can address possibly meeting with her again. And again, just grateful for and wanted to recognize that that is a great comment. It's very spot on, and that we are doing work in that regard to become more culturally proficient as a board to help drive drive, the decisions that are made in the district from an equity lens. So thank you.
We appreciate that very much. Now to Ms. Jennifer Lohman, we wanted to ask, how would you feel about increasing equity in terms of AP classes? What do you think the issue is, if there's any issue, and how do we affect change?
Thank you. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, we can.
Yay. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Can I just give like a 30-second introduction about sort of where I'm coming from as a board member as well? So I am the newest member of the board. I am brand new. I started on July 14th, and I was appointed by the board to fill the elected term of Mr. Tyrone Scott III, who left the district to pursue a really great job opportunity. So I am brand new, and I put that caveat out there because I would definitely like my other board members to jump in and help answer this question if I'm leaving something out. You should also know I have a son who's a freshman at CHS. And I'm looking forward to the day when he can actually enter the school building. And hopefully he'll still be a freshman when that is, when and if that happens. So I have a daughter who's a junior at a private school, and I was really involved with the PTOs in Cheltenham and in the schools in Glenside and at Cedarbrook in particular. And I come at this with a personal history of representing students in public school issues. I worked at an organization called the Education Law Center for over a dozen years, and their mission is to ensure that all children in Pennsylvania have access to a quality public education. So I have always been a passionate advocate for ensuring that all students, and all means kids experiencing homelessness, all means kids in the foster care system, children in the delinquency system, children of color, children who have had contact with the police, and children with disabilities. And so so this is an issue, equity, which I have been, kind of really trying to push the envelope on for a long time. And I'm really happy to be a part of a board and of a school system and of a community that is also very interested and invested in this issue and making equity reality for all the students in our district. So now to the AP question. Could you ask it for me one more time, just so I understand it?
Of course. Do you believe that there is an issue in our AP classes that we do not reach out to every single student, including the disabled students that we have, including persons of color, including by persons of color, and how do we fix that?
It's a good question. I have seen the statistics about the number of students of color who are in our AP classes. I don't know the statistics on the number of students with IEPs, students with disabilities, individualized education programs who access our AP classes. I'd be actually very interested in knowing what that number would be. And if there are still students with IEPs in AP classes, what are their disabilities and what types of supports are they receiving to access those classes? But that being said, I definitely think that based on the numbers I've seen for children of color, there is absolutely an issue as to who has access to the AP, the many AP classes at the high school. And I think that your organization, Student Voices, has already given some really good ideas about how to make sure access to those classes are more equitable, including getting rid of that horribly named form. I did something against educational advice form. That's like the form they give you at the hospital in the ER, like when you want to check yourself out, like against medical advice. So I don't know the process. I think that's a policy decision that the administration and the board will have to discuss, but I agree 100% with the students that that form in and of itself probably presents a tremendous barrier for students who would like to access AP classes from accessing them. I know that it was a barrier for my daughter when she was still in Cheltenham. And one of the reasons why I decided at that point, and that was several years ago before a lot of this work was in place, to not have her be in Cheltenham, was the fact that she was going to have to fill out that form. I think the other issue also, as you pointed out, is that There needs to be appropriate academic support for students who have not accessed AP classes in the past and want to try them. Similar kids with disabilities who want to be, who are striving to be educated in the mainstream environment. You cannot educate a student with an IEP appropriately without providing them supplementary aids and supports if they're going to be in a regular education setting. They may need counseling. They may need some behavior support from a behavior specialist. They may need some small group tutoring. So there's a variety of things that are similar in that respect to students who would like to access AP classes and may be concerned that they don't have the support that they need to. Those kinds of supports need to be put in place, perhaps mentoring, perhaps small group tutoring, just so that we don't say, okay, now you're in AP, good luck, hope you do okay, hope you don't sink. So that's another issue for me. I think the other issue in terms of AP classes, and like I said, my son is brand new to the high school and he has a gifted IEP. And so his experience, I'm sure, is going to be quite different from those kids who are counseled out of taking AP classes, is the issue of who counsels kids into AP classes and who counsels kids out of AP classes, and sort of what do those discussions look like and what are the bases for being recommended for AP classes. These, I'm sure my other board members may know the answers to these questions. I don't, unfortunately. Like I said, I'm new. So I think there's also, and I don't think this is unique to Cheltenham, I saw this in my work too, is that there's also a concern that kids may get overwhelmed if they are in AP classes. And it often comes off as kind of this paternalistic, oh, well, if you take too many AP classes, you might not be able to handle it. So why don't you maybe just not try it? Maybe next year, try it and see how you do this year. And I think we need to come from the perspective of challenging kids and saying, okay, you want to take an AP class? Let's do that. But let's us give you the support that you need in order to be successful in this class. So I think this is an incredibly important issue for Cheltenham to tackle. And particularly because we have so many AP classes. It's not an issue. We're not back at square one with some districts who are still struggling to offer a decent number of AP classes to our students. We offer a lot. The question is exactly what you guys are posing, is how do you get in there and how do you stay in there and be successful in those classes? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Haywood. You wanted to add to that?
I think I got a note from Noah. Did you want to move on, Noah, or can I have like 10 seconds to answer?
Sure. You and Mr. Schultz can also have like 10 seconds. Yeah. Yes,
okay, I'm sorry. I won't take long, but I wanted to share that several years ago, we did remove some of the barriers for enrollment in AP by making it open enrollment. So other than having prerequisite requirements for certain AP classes, enrollment was open, meaning you could raise your hand and say that you wanted to take an AP class. I do agree with Ms. Lohman. We do need to get rid of that form because that's very discouraging. We also allowed students to audit some AP classes. So if they weren't really sure about the workload, they could audit a class. I know that was done several years ago as well. But I think it's really important that these aren't kind of one-off solutions. We need to be systemic about whatever we put in place so it becomes an opportunity to really encourage students to take those, those harder classes, but also provide the appropriate support. And so I know that, we've talked about students going down to Cedarbrook and encouraging students to take AP classes. And actually my daughter started that kind of a program when she was in school. I encourage us to continue doing that, but I do think it's important to have systemic responses, meaning that we identify students that are on the cusp that can be encouraged and pushed to go to AP and make that a annual review of those records so that we can encourage those students to take our over 27 AP offerings. And again, that's the board, the board and the administration's role to make sure that we systemically put those changes in place.
All right, perfect. And now, Mr. Schultz, you can add on to that.
Sure. I just wanted to, the two points I wanted to make, and Ms. Lehman covered it very well. The first is the holistic view of what is happening in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade that causes a student to think of themselves as an AP student. And that needs to be addressed in addition to everything that has been talked about. And I think Ms. Haywood was alluding to that as well when she was talking about the systemic nature. But this is why, I mean, this is going to be a common theme for every specific item in the high school in particular, is what's happening before that gets us to the point, because these are things that pile onto themselves. And so to that end, I think the comment around curriculum being a focus of the district and administration over the past couple of years, and getting the general education program K through 8 to be the best it can be for all students, that is actually a really important part of this AP question. The other thing I'll note is, and this might not be intuitive to people who aren't in the sausage making business, but basically scheduling and the concept of flexible scheduling is actually a really important part of this specific AP question, and making room in a schedule to be able to provide support for students who need it, like provide additional support for students who need to take an AP class. Right now, the current schedule actually doesn't allow us to do that. It's not actually possible to provide supports because of the way we have X number of periods that are X number of minutes. And so the most recent contract with the teachers union, which outlines a timeline for exploring and ultimately coming to an implementation plan around flexible scheduling, that is very intentionally to enable these kinds of supports, plus a million and one other things. But that I just hope folks, when they hear about flexible scheduling, which is a conversation that were it not for COVID, we would be probably in the thick of right now. Keep that in mind, that it is actually an equity issue. Flexible scheduling ends up being an equity issue. So I just wanted to throw those 2 points out. Thank you.
No, thank you. We appreciate that. And then Charles Burdell Williams, you can go.
Yes, I did want to add, again, my fellow board members did very clearly do a really good job at expanding on this question. So I just provide one statement, right? A difficulty that I think exists in most operational settings, whether it's education or manufacturing or many other businesses, is the fact that effectively evaluating the quality of a system, it requires you to have leading and lagging data analysis. And to Mr. Schultz's point, having some leading data that helps us prior to a student's process of selecting their schedule is imperative. Again, that data helps determine and drive interest, and can also set the stage for actions that the administration needs to take in order to ensure interest is being shared, holistically across the entire student body. And from a lagging data standpoint, one of the items of importance is one that's very near and dear to my heart, because I'm seeing it play out right now with my daughter. She has honors and AP classes at the high school, and one of her courses, she is the only student of color in that class. I'll share that the reason why that touches me in such a great way is one of the great reasons why I relocated my family to Cheltenham is for the diversity. And the community that I left, which was out of the state, prior to coming to Cheltenham, my daughter was the only person of color in her kindergarten class as well. And so I'm very driven to understand where we can go with the administration as a partnership to use the leading and lagging data that maybe we haven't discovered quite yet, right? Because there has been significant effort made from the administration's perspective in terms of implementing a process by which we can increase minority participation in AP and honors courses. And the data is showing that there is an increase in participation, which is really good to see. But I'm really excited that there's an opportunity for us to apply new data analysis for some data points that we may not have considered early on in this process, with it being so new and really so unique to Cheltenham, but not unique, in the sense that it's unfamiliar to us, because we know that these challenges exist in many communities. But I'm really excited to continue that work and to continue to build on what the administration has done so far, so we can find greater opportunities for students of color to be able to experience AP and honors courses, at a greater rate than what has been in the past. Thank you.
We really appreciate that response. And so I wanted to give to Bill England the opportunity to discuss the equity plan.
Thank you. The equity plan it's a critical, it's a statement, and then it's a policy, and it's a critical change that we have worked for several years on in Cheltenham. The notion of developing an equity policy, an equity statement, came to light, I want to say, when Napoleon Nelson was still on the board. So it must have been 4 years ago we started talking about this. And essentially the idea is that we need to make certain that we have policies, we have rules of governance, guidance, to ensure that we are addressing the needs of every student, of every child in the district, that we are providing equity and access to our classes, to our resources, and that we are remaking our educational processes to reflect the diversity that we take pride in our community and in our school. The notion of having policy is that it codifies this. It's not just having a list of things that we ought to do. It's not just having some rules or principles. It is trying to put together a framework which can drive everything. A board policy is what drives the district. It is what instructs and informs administration and employees. And the value of putting an equity policy in place is that, as I say, we have a framework to be able to change the way things have happened and make sure that we're focusing on the student body, not a subset of the student body, not to the exclusion of anybody. And from this equity policy, which was just adopted, it provides the opportunity for much more growth in our district, changing the materials that we're using, changing the books that we're reading, the educational planning and the curriculum. That's what the equity policy briefly means to me. And it is one of the most important things that we've done in the last few years.
All right, thank you for that. We have another question by Autumn Angleti. She says, in the 2018 and 19 year, CHS called the police on 15 students over the year, resulting in their arrest for incidents that occurred on school grounds. 100% of these students were Black, according to the police department in Cheltenham. Of these 15 students, 5 were arrested for simple assault, a crime under the non-mandatory reporting category. 3 were arrested for criminal mischief, a commonly racialized crime, and 1 under the discretionary reporting category in the MOU. And 2 were arrested for credit card fraud, another incident under the discretionary reporting category. Meanwhile, CHS was not required by law to have these children arrested. On behalf of the Police-Free CSD, what does the school board make of this data? Why did CHS call the police for these non-mandatory or discretionary reporting instances? what is the school board doing to limit information sharing so that Black students do not get arrested? And this question can go to Joel Fishbein.
Thank you. Ms. Angeletti, that is a fabulous question. The data that you cite has not been brought to our attention until you just did. It calls for us to ask for that data from the police department and the administration from now on. And now that you've brought that to our attention, speaking as one board member, we have a lot of questions to ask and information to obtain to determine how these decisions are being made and to determine whether there needs to be policy around calling the police that is different from what we currently have. But I do want to address the MOU because your question and the way you framed it demonstrates a very strong knowledge of what it does and what it says. And a lot of police-free CSD communications to us have suggested that we have a degree of control over the MOU that we don't really have. A lot of it is prescribed by law that all districts must follow or they're in violation of statutes that govern our conduct. So we can't not have an MOU that says some of the things that it says, including what is a discretionary reporting and what is mandatory reporting. But you've perfectly framed the issue. If we have crimes, alleged crimes that are committed on school grounds that offer discretion about whether to report them to the police, and 100% of those that led to arrests were Black students, we have work to do. And thank you very much for bringing it to our attention.
That's a great response, and we appreciate that, Mr. Fishbein. And would anybody else on the board like to comment on that? I know it's a very present issue. Yeah, Mr. Burdell Williams.
Yes, again, I'll be brief. I don't want to feel like I'm monopolizing on anyone else's opportunities. I feel like I might speak a lot right now in the early part of our discussion. But to Mr. Fishbein's point, I'm very excited at the fact that this information was presented to us in this way. It does beg that we continue to monitor this information on a go-forward basis, and that is likely a position that can evolve into some form of policy, if not a whole policy, but at least a revision or a line item in one of our existing policies. But my initial reaction is disappointment. I will share that I should be surprised, but I'm not. And it's not any offense to the individuals who were involved in providing the communication to the police department in this way. It's just that I think this is a narrative that plays out in our schools, and that one of the items that perpetuates the school to prison pipeline. And I think that the work that is being done by the superintendent and administration to introduce and continue to keep current and hold accountable our teachers to having teachers and administrators to learning the work of cultural proficiency is to learn more of the impact that something that's seemingly very small or could be irrelevant in the learning experience, what that true impact will have on that child's life. From the lens of the teachers and administrators involved in the decisions that were made here to contact the police, not saying they were wrong or right, but just sharing that if in fact a teacher or administrator is expected to be a student's trusted advisor, that means that they're their best friend, right? That's the person you rely on when you're in trouble, the person who helps you through difficult moments with whether it's of mindfulness or the restorative practices, or just information seeking. And these items, I think this particular item here, this data point really shines a light on the fact that there's still a lot of work for us to do in that area, and that if there is in fact a place where we can, again, revise or create, a policy where we can approach this on an annual or periodic basis, using this data point to drive decision making, I think myself as a board member I am extremely excited to be able to participate in that. And if any of my other fellow board members would agree, I think this is something that we should challenge and also discuss on a more detailed level as well. So thank you.
Thank you for that response. We appreciate it. Next, we will have Jennifer Lohman commenting.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to follow up with Mr. Burdell Williams' statement that sadly, I am also not surprised by this information, given the fact that we know that, the national statistics about disproportionate minority contact with the police. Again, that being said, we also don't know the circumstances around any of these incidents. We weren't there when they happened. We don't know, what the administration of the building tried to do first or any of that. But this data on its face is absolutely something, as Mr. Fishbein also said as well, that speaking for myself as a board member, I would like to know more about. I'd actually also like to know more information about how many of those kids, those students on whom the police were called, were students with disabilities who have IEPs. I'd also be interested in knowing how many times, if at all, the police were called that year or this past school year on Cedarbrook students and students at Elkins Park and students at the elementary school. I hope the answer to that question is 0, but having been in the building at Cedarbrook a lot last year as a Cedarbrook PTO president, I know that it was not 0. I was there when the police came at one point. I don't know the outcome of it. So I'd be curious to see those statistics from our other school buildings as well. I know we're all focusing on the high school, but I don't want us to forget about the other buildings. The other thing I want to just give is a little bit of historical perspective on police presence in schools, in public schools, which is in many ways really a relatively recent thing. We had public schools in this country for, over a good 120, 25 years. It's only really in the past 30, maybe even 25 years where police and policing in public schools has become a significant issue. Some of that has to do with the passage by Congress of the Gun-Free Schools Act. I think it was in 1995, which required school districts to adopt a policy of expelling all kids who brought guns to school for at least a year in order to receive federal financial assistance of a certain type. Many states went one further, including Pennsylvania, and they adopted a law called Act 26, which made it illegal for students to which required kids to be expelled for a year if they brought a weapon to school, and also required the police to be called. And so that advent of these kinds of laws that kind of open the door for police presence in the school system is actually really relatively new. And the reason I say that is because students and the public need to know that in order to really change, we can do a lot as a school board, but in order to really, really change the issue of police contact in schools, we need to do advocacy work at both a state and a federal level. During the Obama administration's years, their Department of Education was really trying to address the issue of disproportionate minority contact with police, starting with requiring schools to collect this type of data, which was often hidden and not easily accessible. So I think we need to also be educating ourselves on what laws are out there and the reasons for why school boards have to do what they have to do, because as Mr. Fishbein said, we're required to do these things by state and by some federal laws. So if we want to effect real change, we also have to do advocacy on a different plane as well.
All right, and next we'll hear from Julie Haywood, who will make a comment regarding the same thing.
Yeah, thank you, Noah, and thank you again for the question. I think it's an important one, and it's one that we've looked at in terms of the police-free CSD request to the school board. And as it relates to the specific question that was asked, as it relates to the MOU, again, I wanted to just state that the MOU is a document that much of the mandatory reporting is prescribed by the PA Safe Schools Act. And the discretionary reporting is just that. So I'm sure the administration and the board would be very interested to verify and validate the information that was shared today, because if there was discretionary reporting that should not have necessarily called in a police officer to school, I'm sure the administration would want to understand that, as well as the board. I do think it is important, as Ms. Lohman said, to really understand the information behind each of these incidents, because there may be information that we may not be aware of as a board. And I think it would be really important for the administration to also understand and be able to research that information before responding. Just quickly, I wanted to share that we have gotten a lot of the emails from Police Free CSD that are asking for additional requests from the board. And I wanted to share that the board and administration will be issuing a joint communication that really will also share in part much of the work that has been going on an ongoing basis with the at the administrative level, at the board level, so that everyone can have a better understanding of what currently is in place as it relates to restorative justice and practices and other things in our school district. And I wanted to offer that we would welcome an opportunity, and we will, schedule that, because the MOU is up for review again in July of 2021. And that's an opportunity for the board, for the community, to ask ourselves the question, a larger question: what's the climate and culture we want to have in our schools, well beyond an MOU? But it's also an opportunity to revisit the MOU at that time. I want to caution us, though, that there are mandatory reporting requirements that we will not be able to change in the MOU. But it's an opportunity to at least look at it and revisit it from that perspective, a more larger perspective of really what do we want our climate and culture to look like if it isn't where we want it to be right now. And so we do take all of those, the information that was shared today very seriously, because it's very important to get to the heart of that. Very important.
Thank you,
Noah.
Ms. Haywood. Of course. Now we'll hear from Bill England.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. I won't repeat what others have said. So there's been three important movements that I've seen among the student body. The first, in recent times, it was see our faces, hear our voices. Then it was Black in Mako, and then it was police-free CSD. And each of these ties together. Some of this goes beyond the notion of police. Some of it goes to how are we operating our buildings, and how are people being identified, and when are the police being called? When incidents are brought to the board where the police have been involved, it's always an unsettling thing. And yes, it is typically students of color. And as I say, some of that starts before the police are involved. Once the police are on the scene in certain cases, it just proceeds, the momentum is there. But the questions we need to be asking is, why are police being called? Why are police being involved? I mean, there are clear-cut cases where that must happen, as Ms. Haywood just said. There are defined areas in the law, but there are other times where these questions we ought to be asking. And redirecting our resources towards student supports and counseling are much better uses of our resources going forward. So I think there's an opportunity to look at and talk about the MOU. I think that holding us accountable to how things are happening in the buildings. And it is certainly not something exclusively to the high school. We have had police involvement all the way to the elementary schools. These are great questions. Keep them coming.
All right, we appreciate that very much. And now we will hear from Dr. Marseille, who has had his hand raised. All right, can you talk or can we hear you?
He may need to unmute himself, Noah.
Yeah, it says he can unmute. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I apologize. I wanted to actually raise my hand on a number of topics, but I felt that this was not a superintendent panel meeting, and I was afraid I'd take over like many of my colleagues who kept their statements really brief, or at least the board members who kept their comments brief, knowing that each question they can spend an hour talking about. But I did want to chime in with regards to the police MOU and the question that led up to the conversation with regards to the 15 individual cases and the language with regards to, or the statement that some were discretionary, some were mandatory. To what extent did administration make those calls, even though they were non-mandatory reported incidences? And I want to echo Ms. Lehman and Mr. England's statements, along with Ms. Haywood, that I don't want to speak specifically to those 15 incidences because they're significant. And I know someone who asked the question raised a specific incident, which there are each of those situations mitigating factors and facts that individuals on the ground are not aware of that led to those particular decisions. So with that, I want to say this, that when disproportionality exists and inequity exists, it is a far gone conclusion that it is a domino effect that will impact every other aspect of our educational experience or our global or our planet, right? So if you look at inequities and you look at how COVID-19 is not only ravaging this country and the world, but when you break that data down and you look at, well, to what extent is that impacting people of color, people of poverty? Well, you see the cascading impact of inequity. Once it rears its ugly head, it has a vicious domino effect, and it's to be expected that it's going to continue to roll in other areas as well. So with that statement, the reality is that we have significantly reduced police involvement in this district over the last 5 years. The number 15 is better than 75. The number 45 is better than 75. And of course, the number 35 is significantly better than the first two numbers, and where we are with the number 15. With regards, with regards to that, and my colleagues have shared this, board members have shared this, is that the larger question that I would like, and just like Mrs. Haywood said, that, you know, I look forward to engaging in conversation to who the leadership members are of Police Free CSD, to ask, how do we prevent the criminalization of behavior of students of color that impact academic and social emotional outcomes? Because the reality, it happens far before we get to the high school or the middle school. It is as subtle as the removal of a student from an elementary classroom because of what is perceived to be a negative behavior. It is the student won't put his or her pencil down and is causing a disruption that leads to then that student being removed from class. And once you remove that student from the learning experience, it creates a number of identity formations, not only with how that student sees him or herself as a non-learner, but it also may reinforce his or her colleagues' perception of that student once they see that student being removed. So when you look at that, and then Ms. Lehman spoke to the issue about special education and would like to know those numbers, it's a far gone conclusion that when you have inequitable outcomes, it will rear its head every place else. So the percentage of students, if you took a look at that 15, and you know all the other achievement or all the other inequitable outcomes within this district, it's a far gone conclusion that a significant proportion of those students, of course, would be, because of previous data points that happen in and outside of school, would be students of color and would be students with IEPs, considering this district has an overwhelming disproportionality problem with 76% of the students in IEPs are students of color. So if you extrapolate that data point and then think about, well, who's being called upon the most for police interactions, it's students of color. Then you can extrapolate that, well, if 76% of students of color have an IEP, you can extrapolate that that 15% will be a large number as well. So one of the board members said this last Tuesday eloquently about this iceberg analogy. And then underneath that are the root causes of what we are seeing. Not that police contact is not a big issue that we need to address, but it is Mr. England's point where, to what extent do those on the ground believe particular behaviors are so criminalized in a way that pushes for the involvement of the police? Because for those who've been on the board, if you remember, when I arrived into the district and we started to question why police involvement was needed, we received a significant amount of pushback from this community. We received pushback from students as well, saying that they didn't feel safe, or staff who said they didn't feel safe, or staff who said and parents who were saying we were not reporting enough. We were hiding information. And this idea about, which is what's happening across this country again, if you listen to it, is about people wanting to bring law and order back, right? That type of statement was what was being said 5 years ago when we were trying to just ask the question. And the question was this: how do we prevent the criminalization of behavior of students of color that impact academic and social and emotional outcomes? That was precipitated that. And out of that conversation came this resentment about either being anti-disciplinary or anti-accountability or anti-police. So we've been wrestling with that pushback from large number of stakeholders trying to change the ideology about this behavior doesn't need to be criminalized, right? And we talked about implicit bias. We shared a lot of research at the elementary level about the school to prison pipeline in terms of what does it look like when second, third, fourth graders are engaging in what 95% of the public would consider adolescent behavior, but yet when particular subgroups behave in the same manner, we criminalize it. When two kids are in an elementary playground and they push each other, there's this call for one of those students based on color, because the data shows it, while their push was so egregious, right, was so damaging, both physically and emotionally to the victim, that we need to call the police. We need to let people know this is not tolerated in Cheltenham School District. And if you don't call the police, we will call the police, right? So I think there's a lot of mitigating factors involved in that. And I think it's a great question. Every year we provide the board and we have to provide the state. And the report is due relatively soon with all the serious incident. Is called a safety report that we give, that we meet with the police every single month to confirm when they're involved, how they're involved, are they accurately reporting that? And then we eventually send it to the state. And we, as we send it to the state, we send that into the report to the board as well. So 15 is high. But we've come a long way in terms of the close to 100 number that we had when we first arrived around contact and what that really means. So when our administrators have discretion, I want to be very clear that there are other mitigating factors about that case that a significant amount of individuals do not have all the resources with. And when we can, we would rather not. But the question is, why are certain individuals believing the need to do that? And when the police arrive, to Mr. England's point, that it now becomes their investigation, right? Can't tell the police how to run their investigation after I've called them. And they've been collaborative in terms of that process. They didn't come find the student. Somewhere in our system triggered that call, and that individual or police officers arrived and proceeded with their standard protocol on when they get on the scene. So I just wanted to share that, and apologize I didn't jump in before, but I didn't want to monopolize all the time, as I wanted the board, this is the board's panel discussion, but I felt I needed to jump in on the police matter and the MOU and the incidences of 15 students. So thank you very much.
We appreciate that very much, Dr. Marseille. Now, to our next question from Venus. She wanted to say, in terms of hearing all student concerns, how does the board reach out to the students to hear what they have to say, if at all? I know you meet with the student group leaders led by administrators, which is appreciated, but often targets a particular type of student. Town halls like these are a start, but again, only certain groups of people would take the initiative to come to a meeting such as this one. Although many times you may meet with Black students, it's really the students that are being impacted most by racial biases that manifest in disciplinary actions in education. How do you plan to hear student voices that are often silenced or not heard from, but equally as important as those are used to hearing from? So in essence, how do we reach out to those students who are not often heard from the school board? Right, and I'm sorry, Joel Fishbein, you can take this one. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Mr. Cohen, you can.
Okay, thank you. The school board generally has not done a good job in terms of reaching out to students to hear from them. And I think it's partly because of the relationship of the school board with the administration and the teachers. And we're looking at a high level in terms of policy issues and setting direction for the school district and not getting involved in daily issues. That doesn't mean that we should not do a better job. We should do a better job from my perspective. Several years ago, I'm not sure who developed this, but it was very meaningful to me, and hopefully the other board members at the time and also the students that participated. There were a range of students that came and spoke to the school board in a public meeting. And they were students, from my perspective, that really represented different parts of the school district. They were all high school students in terms of different achievement levels. And they spoke in meaningful, really impactful ways to me in terms of biases that they experienced, everything from microaggressions to outright racial biases and also gender biases. And I still recall some of the statements several years later that were made. And I'd like to see if that could be implemented again on a periodic basis. And the students, again, have to be willing. I'm not trying to place blame on them if they're not willing to do it, but they have to also be willing to open up in somewhat of a public setting about how they've been impacted. That's one approach I'd like to see revisited as well. Another aspect is that we became aware, and I believe that the entire board, I know the entire board is aware, and I think that most of the entire board has read Black and Monco on Instagram. And for those that don't know, that's a social media page where it's throughout all Montgomery County, but there have been a number of really negative, damaging, frankly, impactful statements that have been hurtful to me as a community member and also a school board member in terms of the way that minority students have been treated, both by some current faculty members and also some students that are current students and past students in the district. And those are statements that we've been monitoring. I know that the administration is looking at a way to try to better hear those students and hopefully also do it in a way where the school board can firsthand also hear from some of the students about ways that they've been impacted negatively by different types of aggression and racist statements and negative statements about their background, whether it's based on race or identity or gender, and a range of issues, so that we can become aware of those and try to identify ways to address those through policy, and also support and encourage administration to take appropriate action with staff members that are making those statements and doing that negative and damaging behavior. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, but those are some things that I'd like to see us do. And again, we can and should do a better job in terms of doing it because of the key critical importance of the issue. One thing I will say is that individual school board members, and there are also ways of approaching the board through email and also at public board meetings, we encourage, or I encourage from my perspective, that students and parents and faculty members and community members come forward if they're aware of key issues. And in terms of this issue at hand, if they've experienced issues or they're aware of things firsthand, or if they know things that are happening, to please let us know and reach out to us so that we can become aware of it and that we can be educated, frankly, and that we can work with the administration to try to make sure that we try to take appropriate action as a school district, whether it's in terms of policy or, again, addressing issues with staff, to hopefully make sure that A, behavior gets changed, the policies get changed, and that B, that and C, that future students don't have to face these types of behaviors. So that's my response. Thank you.
All right, perfect response. We appreciate that very much. Now we will have Joel Fishbein addressing a comment from Elisa Davidson saying, I sent an email 2 weeks ago suggesting that you reach out to Lieutenant Sinder regarding calls to CPD or Cheltenham Police Department. In 2018, Cheltenham staff recorded 285 incidents, with 142 of those involving local law enforcement. The statistics and research, both locally and nationally, prove that police involvement is racially unfair, as well as have students asking for a police-free school zone. Let's do it. I don't understand the delay. School districts and cities have proven that they can move quickly on this issue after years and years of not acting. Cheltenham should be a leader in this movement. And Mr. Fishbein, you can touch on that.
We received dozens of emails from police CSD, and we are compiling our response. We did not get a timely response out to all the emails, and for that, we take responsibility. That is something that, not to make excuses, but we have been inundated with work here, and there were a lot of emails. I'm happy that we're having this conversation. The one impression that I want to correct, if it was resulting from our silence in response to a lot of the questions by email, that the idea that we didn't care or we weren't engaged in thinking about it is the wrong impression. We were and we are, and the data points that you're citing, we need to learn more about them. And the concept that all of the demands of police-free CSD be met is something that we are going to have to wrestle with, because we are not, as a board, sure that all of them can be met. We aren't ignoring it. We are thinking deeply about it. It's as important to us as it is to you. But and that's not a really satisfactory answer. You want to see results, and rest assured we are working towards results. And when we have tangible actions that we can report on in board meetings and in communications to the community, we will be doing that.
All right, thank you. To Lehman, Ms. Lehman, could you answer how the board will combat this issue of racial injustice and explain why this occurs in our schools.
Would you like me to respond to the beginning part of that question? Is that the question with Black students make up 51% of CSD but account for 80%?
Oh,
Okay.
well, okay, if you would like.
Okay, it's 80% of out-of-school suspensions. So I'll just read that statistic again, just so people that Black students make up 51% of CSD. I don't know what year these stats are from, but account for 80% of out-of-school suspensions. Clearly punitive disciplinary protocols like out-of-school suspensions disproportionately target Black students. Can the board explain why this occurs in our schools and how will the board combat this issue? I think that some of the previous answers have already tried to explain the disproportionate discipline experienced by our Black students. It results from implicit and explicit bias of staff, I think, sometimes not knowing culturally appropriate ways to address student behavior. And I know that the district has been working on that for some time now, with providing required professional development for its staff on addressing their implicit and explicit biases and how it impacts their response to student behavior. I definitely think that is part of the disproportionality. I also believe that, and this is why initiatives like school-wide positive behavior supports are so important, and increased in-house mental health supports are also important, that I think that we need to provide alternative ways, and we are working on this. This is another issue I know Dr. Mercier has been working on since he came here, on offering other ways for addressing student behavior rather than punitive out-of-school discipline, because that doesn't solve anything for anybody. It just puts the kid out of school, but it doesn't actually teach them how to change their behavior, which things like mental health counseling and school-wide positive behavior supports do. And I know that we're working on this, and obviously and clearly, more work needs to be done. And I think that as we grapple with this as a board, as the administration grapples with this issue, we are going to have to continue to ask ourselves, what is it about that behavior of a student that causes the adult in the room to act in a way that perhaps there could be a different way for that adult to react to that behavior? And what types of supports not only does the student need, but does the adult need in order to change their behavior in reaction to that? And the example that someone gave of a student tapping their pencil on a table or something like that, for some staff members, that's not going to bother them. They're able to ignore that. For other staff members, that may lead to a disciplinary referral if a student doesn't stop. I think that these issues are really difficult, and ones we also have to continue to engage our staff in solutions for as well. This has to be a collective kind of reckoning, that can't just be top down. It has to be also bottom up, and we have to come together as a community in terms of really saying this is what we're really requiring from our staff and from our teachers, and this is not acceptable if we hear comments from you or you have certain responses to certain types of behaviors.
Thank you, Ms. Lohman. All right, for the next and final question from Leah, she wants to know, what do we do about teachers or staff who continue to speak to families or students or act in ways that are racial or inequitable, or racist, sorry. Whether it's microaggressions, higher rates of discipline, continuing to use videos, books, etc., that are not inclusive or contain cultural appropriation, and etc. Are all staff required to attend PD surrounding racial and equity culture competency? I know they have a PD, the PD, but it is required without exception. What do we do when this behavior is not changed? And this question will go to David Cohen.
Thank you. In terms of the question, I'll answer the second part first. Staff has professional development where during Dr. Mercé's tenure, there's been a lot of focus, time, and bandwidth capacity around professional development around racial equity and also cultural competency and related issues. As a board member, it's very frustrating to me that we've seen data where the percentage of staff that's absent on professional development days versus other typical days where there's not professional development is alarmingly high. And there's nothing in the current contract that we can do to require that teachers attend professional development and not take a day off from work. I'm not saying that there are not legitimate reasons why teachers are taking off, but clearly the disproportionality between professional development days and absences versus other days that correspond, for example, days of the week, and the percentage is meaningfully higher. So teachers are missing professional development of all types, including racial equity, cultural competency, and other meaningful professional development days. And that's very frustrating to me as a board member and something that I want to personally see addressed. But again, in the current contract, we have no way of addressing that in terms of requiring them to not miss those development days. We are looking at ways to be creative and also positive to make sure they participate in that development. But again, we cannot mandate it per se. To answer the first part of the question, if there are teachers that we're aware of that in different parts of the spectrum are racist or inequitable, then we're working with the administration and from my perspective as a board member, supporting the administration to identify ways to address that under, again, the terms of the contract. We have a contract with the union and the teachers are covered by that. And there are certain procedural and legal and administrative matters that have to go through a process. So even if a teacher does something where it's alarming or it's wrong, the teachers still have certain rights under the contract, under the law, that we have to follow. And we just cannot unilaterally take action without following those requirements, as frustrating as it might be in terms of the issues and the way the teachers are behaving in some situations. On the other hand, we are also working even beyond professional development to try to, as was mentioned before, to improve the materials that are being presented to make sure that they're more reflective of our community, that they are not inherently biased or also overly focused on one part of the community, notably the white community, in terms of what they represent, both in terms of either the content of the books or also the authors of the books, is something we're addressing as well. And we're also trying to address beyond professional development days, other ways of, through knowledge and education building, capacity building, trying to address teachers in terms of informing them and working with them to try to make sure where there are more along the lines of microaggressions or things that are said that are inappropriate versus just frankly alarmingly, blatantly racist and inappropriate. We're trying to make sure that we educate and inform them to minimize those from happening as well beyond professional development. So to wrap up this question, it's something that we're trying to address in a variety of ways. There are binding limitations that we have to follow in terms of due process, both contractually and legally, and we're trying to work within that framework and support the administration in their efforts to try to address this key critical issue. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dan Schultz?
Sure, thanks. I wanted to pull in, I think this may have been a question, I don't know if it was explicitly answered. It was very early on, and it was around the equity policy. The question was around what's the summary of the equity policy? And I wanted to tie it into this and also use that as a chance to highlight the equity policy that was just passed. The equity policy talks a little bit about, talks about a lot of very important things. There is a reference to professional development. There is a reference to use of data. And I think that what Mr. Cohen was talking about with the limits we face as a board, and I think that the around requiring folks attend professional development, there are challenges that are contractual challenges, but what I think we as a district are moving towards is trying to, and the equity policy is a mechanism that will, I think, push this forward, trying to use data and outcome-based data. So what are the actual student outcomes at a classroom level to hold the adults accountable? So being able to say, if you are a student who goes into this classroom, we should not be able to predict how successful you will be or unsuccessful you will be based on the color of your skin, your gender, your special needs, whatever identifying factor it is. And so my hope is that teachers, teachers explicitly who may not attend professional development because it may not be, there may not be direct consequences of not attending a given professional development, are inspired to attend professional development because they need to learn what they need to learn in order to have the correct outcome and be held accountable based on the outcome, not based on the attendance of development. So I think I may have tied myself in knots there, but really what I'm trying to say is that we need to move to a point where the adults are held accountable based on the data and the student outcomes. I also just wanted to, since we are at the last question, just highlight that we are at a board level, we're way up here, and we're setting policies, we're thinking in terms of systems and goals for the district, and the trickle down effect of those things, execution happens at the ground level, at the teacher level, at the building administrator level, and at various levels in between. And so some of the, I think Mr. Fishbein alluded to this in the very beginning, just making sure that everyone understands from a theory of change, like if you want a change to happen, who's the right person to talk to, and how do you escalate that in the right way? I think everyone on all these questions have been really thoughtful and very appropriate, but I also want to make sure that we are thinking about how systemic racism affects this district, not just in terms of fixing racism.
Oops, hold on. Can you unmute yourself real quick? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How do we basically the idea that there are racist policies, there are racist ideas, and racist from the Kendi definition of these are promoting unequal outcomes. And we at a board level are able to help address racist policies and to create systems that combat racist ideas. And we do need the entire community's support to execute those policies, to push back on policies and identify policies that seem like they haven't been refined to the level of acceptable nature, but also to work with the personal connections they have with fellow community members, fellow students and parents, teachers and principals to challenge when they see microaggressions. The board is not going to stop. I, as a board member, am not going to stop a microaggression in Jane Doe's first grade class, but a parent who hears a story does have a better shot at addressing that. So that's all. Thanks.
All right, we appreciate it very much, Dan, and we appreciate the entire board for being here. And we wanted to thank everybody for coming, especially the board. We think this has been a great discussion, and we are definitely very excited to have 3 more of these throughout the year, each pertaining to our own theme. Thank you for all of your questions, and we hope you guys have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you, Noah and Lisa. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for organizing this.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Great session.
Yeah,
Appreciate your
awesome. Thank
time.
you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Very, very appreciative of the community input and board participation. Thank you, Noah, and to Lisa for helping us today as well.
Yep, we'll continue listening and talking. Thanks.